All right, welcome everyone to this special Early Investing KingsCrowd webinar. I am Vin Narayanan, Senior Managing Editor for Early Investing, and we've got a great webinar for you. Let me introduce Chris Lustrino, the CEO and founder of KingsCrowd, Andy Gordon, one of the co-founders of Early Investing, and joining us for this webinar are Jonathan Cohen, the CEO and founder of GeneSystems, 2020 GeneSystems, and Dr. Michael Leibowitz, who's got all the science on lockdown for us. And so we're going to be talking about our rapid COVID-19 test that 2020 GeneSystems is bringing to the market. The timing for this is remarkable. First, some background on 2020 GeneSystems. This is actually a startup that's been around for a few years, and their primary product is detecting cancer early. They layer artificial intelligence over a blood test, and through that process, they can find cancer a lot earlier and a lot more accurately than most of the tests out there. But with COVID-19 raging on, and the country in the middle of a lockdown, except for a handful of states, they've turned their attention to helping solve the testing problem. And so they're coming to market soon with a test. And so let's start at this point. Jonathan, we'll start with you. Your primary product is cancer screening, but what prompted you to start investigating COVID-19 and COVID-19 testing?
Well, first, thank you very much, Vin, for having us on this afternoon. So 2020 GeneSystems is headquartered in Rockville, Maryland, just outside of our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. And as Vin mentioned, our core business is early cancer detection. We have a product called One Test to help screen for to help identify early a number of deadly cancers, including those of the lung, liver, pancreas, and colon. And actually, just yesterday, we learned that someone that had the test, it actually helped identify an early stage, we think an early stage colon cancer. We're trying to get further information. But as part of our legacy, we have a history of responding in national emergencies to bring innovative and important detection and diagnostic kits to market. In the wake of the anthrax incidents many, many years ago, we invented and commercialized a product called BioCheck to screen suspicious powders. And to this day, that product is essentially the gold standard that emergency responders throughout the United States and around the world use when they have powder incidents. So this is frankly part of our DNA and part of our values as a company. So another aspect of our company that is important to note is we have longstanding and deep relationships throughout Greater China. And as in late January, early February, when the epicenter, if you will, of this pandemic was in China, we began to reach out to our collaborators there to identify potential solutions. And what emerged was this new type of testing where one can with a drop of blood, a finger stick of blood, can identify antibodies to that are associated with this pandemic. One called IgG, the other IgM. And the test is configured not unlike a home pregnancy test. It's very simple, results in a matter of minutes, and what we're seeing in the accuracy is quite good. So we took time to survey and interview an array of companies, and there are well over 24 that we know of just in China making these, and now not a small number in Korea, Taiwan, and increasingly Europe and North America. So we began in February interviewing these companies to try to find the ones that had the best data, the best reputation, and regulatory approvals, and have put together three essentially distribution agreements with some degree of exclusivity around each one. The scope varies a bit company to company, but we put all that together, and now we're on the cusp of delivering our first set of products to American medical institutions.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Jonathan. And you said that you checked these companies out. Now, did you test the tests being made by these companies and vet the results? And how confident are you that these are companies providing accurate, state-of-the-art, technology results?
Good question, particularly in the wake of some incidences in Europe over the weekend reported in Spain and the Czech Republic, where certain tests, antibody tests like these coming from China, were found allegedly to be performing well below expectations. So the answer to your question is yes and yes. Our due diligence began by analyzing the data of the manufacturers, and in some cases it was considerable. And Michael will elaborate on it, but there are certain things that we look for and that experts here in this country look for in these types of tests. And one of them is whether or not they cross-react with seasonal coronaviruses. After all, nearly a third of common colds are a type of coronavirus. So if these were not specific to the COVID-19 variety of coronavirus, there would be a slew of false positives, and the value of the test would plummet. So that was one of the things we looked for, and of the three companies, two of the three had data showing that their tests do not cross-react with common or seasonal coronavirus. So the analysis began by analyzing their data, but it did not end there. And I'm going to let Michael elaborate. We have some, frankly, breaking news. If this interview had been even 24 hours ago, we would have very limited information on the performance here in the United States. But thankfully, we have results now from, I believe, 4 different institutions here in the United States. And by and large, and this is real-world, hands-on data from the front lines, not generated in a lab, because often in a lab you get pristine, circumstances, and the results can be a little bit better. The gold standard, if you will, is how does it really perform in the setting to which you expect the test to be used. And we're very pleased to say that these tests, at least with one of the manufacturers, we tested 2 of them, with one of the manufacturers, seems to be performing pretty much as expected. And I'll let Michael elaborate on that a little more.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. So we contacted a number of different institutions throughout the country where COVID-19 patients are coming in and are showing up. And we asked them to do quality control for us. We shipped them our tests in a research use only format. In other words, it's the same test that we ultimately would bring to market, but we felt we had to label it at this point as research use only until we could verify the information that we got from the manufacturers. So we approached a total of 7 different institutions over the last several days. And in that period, we've gotten responses now from 4 of those institutions. Those institutions include hospital, doctors' offices, as well as emergency departments. And what they did was they took these kits to the bedside and they used them at the bedside at point of care. This is a point of care test. This is a test that you can use at the patient's bedside or in the office and gives you a result in approximately 10 to 15 minutes. So we sent the tests to these providers, and the providers used them. We now have data from 20 patients who are PCR confirmed negative. That means that they had the standard molecular test that has been performed that you hear about in the news mostly as the standard for identifying the COVID-19 virus. and they were all negative. And they were also negative on our test. So that was 100% of all 20 individuals who were tested that did not have COVID-19, as confirmed by the standard PCR test, did not have a positive result on our test either. So that gets to, are there false positives? Obviously, it's a small sample size, and we would have to test a lot more to truly establish the false positive rate, but it performed within the manufacturer's specifications. The flip side of that is, of course, what about patients who are positive for COVID-19? And so we also looked at 18 patients so far that were confirmed positive by PCR. So again, by the standard test, and they were also tested with our kit. Now, one has to understand a little bit about the differences between what the two tests measure before understanding the differences in the result. The PCR test measures RNA coming from the virus. So it is a direct measurement of the virus itself. The rapid test that we have is an antibody-based test, and it measures a patient's immune response to the virus. So clearly, on day one, when a patient becomes infected with virus, he's not going to automatically have an immune response. It takes a little bit of time for that immune response to develop. In our understanding, it takes approximately 10 days from the time when symptoms show up. Now, having said that, of the 18 positive patients, we had 13 positive. A lot of the patients were not within that 10-day period. In other words, they were within the early stages. So we missed certain patients, but they were also not necessarily expected to yet have an antibody response. So we saw a sensitivity. In other words, we detected approximately 72% of all the positive patients. Now, the manufacturer did a larger study. The manufacturer had a sensitivity of 88%, but were using patients who were farther out in the process after infection. So we believe that we have verified that the test is working according to the manufacturer's specifications. As I mentioned to you before, this is not the end of our quality study. We have a total of 7 different sites that are doing this. We've heard from 4. I expect to hear from the other 3 over the next day or so. And by the end of this process, we would expect to have roughly close to 40 positive and 40 confirmed negative by PCR patients tested with our test in order to, again, verify that what the manufacturer has said is indeed correct.
Dr. Leibowitz, walk us through the mechanics of the test a little bit. I mean, how is the test conducted, and what else does it measure for? What else can you determine with this test?
So, absolutely. So I'm going to start with your last question first. This is a COVID-19 test. This is measuring antibodies against COVID-19. The format of the test is applicable to other types of infectious disease, but this test is designed specifically for COVID-19. Having said that, the test is, again, detecting the patient antibody response. So we are looking for the production of antibodies. It is a blood test. It is a blood test that takes a drop of blood. It can be done with a simple sample coming from a finger stick, similar to the finger stick that's used by diabetics on multiple times a day in order to measure the sugar in their own blood. So it's very simple to obtain a sample for the test. It does not require, as does the PCR-based testing, this nasopharyngeal approach where they stick something up and down your nose. It's a very simple sample to get. It is also a point of care test, meaning it's going to develop right in front of your eyes. It's not a sample that has to be sent back to a lab. The mechanics of the test on the molecular level are that the test cassette has within it colored beads that have proteins that are made that are similar to proteins in the COVID-19 virus itself. So these are recombinantly made proteins that are placed on the beads. When the blood sample is put into the sample well, the antibodies in the blood attach to those beads. You then put in several drops of buffer, and the buffer causes the beads to travel down a membrane which is within the cassette. Impregnated on the membrane further down are antibodies that bind either to human IgG or human IgM. IgG and IgM are the standard antibody responses, the types of antibody that a human would produce in response to the virus. We are looking for antibodies that are specific to COVID-19. So if the antibody binds the bead, and then the antibody from patient blood binds the bead, and then the antibody bead complex binds further down on the cassette, then the colored beads collect and a line develops, a visible line develops on the actual cassette itself, which you can visualize. On the same cassette is a control line. The control should always develop. If the control doesn't develop, then that means that the test failed. So built into this test is a fail-safe to make sure that the test itself is working properly.
So once you, we've talked about the test and how it works, but how long do you think it'll actually take to get approval to be able to go to market? And what is kind of the general go-to-market strategy to get this up and running sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I can take that one. So we're basically on market to cut to the chase. But let me explain to your listeners a bit about the FDA's model here, because it's quite unlike anything that I'm aware of that they've done before. So we all learned a lot about the problems with testing last month, the backlog. We sort of all got off to a false start here with the CDC and the FDA. But since then, the FDA has relaxed a lot of the regulations, especially those around these what are called serology or blood antibody tests. They have essentially down-regulated them so that they're not reviewing and approving test by test. What they have done, quite wisely I might add, is for the entire class of tests, they've said, if the test is validated, and they provide some guidelines as to what that means, the manufacturer and or their distributor can provide notice to the FDA, as long as the product label, which is the kind of like the instruction sheet, if you will, inside the test, has certain disclaimers that the FDA mandates, you can go to market. So we and a number of other companies, well over 25 at last check, have provided that requisite notice. So we are good to go, so to speak. And the fact that we've done this additional verification, I think that the FDA uses that term, not validation, but verification, to verify what was already done, is probably something that not all companies are doing. I believe some are and some are not. But it's the right thing to do, and we were going to do it even before we learned about the problems in Europe. But that, of course, put an exclamation point on the need to do this. So we are filling orders as early as tomorrow. We've had a lot of them over the last 2 weeks. They come in every 5 minutes or so. And we are buying more supply from this one particular manufacturer whose test generally performed just according to their specifications.
Got it. And the go-to-market plan, just so I understand how these people are coming in and who you're planning to kind of sell to scale this up, what does that look like?
There's an old saying, build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door. Frankly, until I saw this product, I've never seen that actually happen in the real world, but in this case, that's actually true. We've done virtually no marketing. We did a single press release about 2 weeks ago, and that alone appears to be generating virtually all of the demand we've seen so far, and maybe word of mouth. We're going to do another press release maybe tomorrow with the results of this verification study here in the United States, but people are coming to us, and in fairly high numbers. So I don't think we're going to need to do a lot of marketing. We're just responding to the inquiries that are coming in.
Yeah, this sounds like it would be ideal for home testing, but is that something that's down the road, or who are you? It sounds like you're primarily selling this to doctors, hospitals, institutions, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that is the mandate right now of FDA. The FDA's March 16th guidance, which is what we're operating under, limits this distribution to what it was called point-of-care healthcare workers and labs at a point-of-care level. If we want to make these available for home use, and I think we do, that requires the submission of something called an EUA. It's an acronym for Emergency Use Authorization, and that will be given more scrutiny. My crystal ball tells me that by the end of this month, these tests will be available for home use. I could be wrong about that, but I think it makes so much sense. Now, whether the EUA will be granted to us or one of our competitors remains to be seen. I suspect a number of companies are starting to work on them, and we plan to do that as well. But I do think that by May, you're going to start seeing these types of tests will be as common to the average American as a tube of toothpaste. They will be buying them at their local pharmacies, ordering them on Amazon, and will be using them every couple of days probably. I may be off on that, but that's how I see this playing out through the summer. And particularly as large employers, and we've had a number of inquiries from large employers, Fortune 500 companies, start bringing people back to work, it will be very helpful to know their basically their immune status, their IgG and IgM status.
Jonathan, is this going to be like a lot of things we see going on, that once a useful tool to deal with the coronavirus is discovered, and there's going to be so much demand and not enough supply, and it leads to frustration? And if you're right, and this becomes that common, are there going to be enough of these tests to go around? And how about the supply that you can get your hands on? Can you give us any idea of what kind of numbers we're talking about here for you and the supply that you think that you can be providing?
Yes. So we've been told by one of the manufacturers that we could get 2 million tests in about 10 days, 7 to 10 days. Another manufacturer said they could do about 100,000 a day. So the good news about these types of tests, they're much less likely to have the supply problems that the swab test, the PCR test, have been facing and are still facing. So I think there will be a tremendous demand, but I also think there will be tremendous amounts of supply. The key will be the quality control. I think the quality of these tests will vary, and that's where I think companies like 2020 that are we're a science-based organization. At first glance of the maybe 24 or more companies in the United States that are now offering these tests or planning to offer these tests, I would say more than 2/3 of them are not diagnostics companies. They might be medical device companies, medical device distributors. There's one specialty pharma. There's a kind of a telemedicine app company. And as you can appreciate, there's a lot of blocking and tackling that goes into releasing a quality test. So I think we do bring something to the table here in that we know what is required to make sure that a test is working as intended.
Does this test show any level of immunity towards the virus or not?
Michael, you want to take that one?
Yes, sure. So the simple answer is we don't completely know yet. The antigens that this test is based on in the past are similar to antigens that were found, and when I say antigens, the proteins in the virus that we are testing for antibody binding to are proteins that were known to be attacked by the human immune system in the SARS outbreak that took place in the early 2000s. It was 2004 or so, which is a very similar virus to the virus that's affecting us now. In that instance, the antibodies produced against these similar proteins were what they called neutralizing antibodies, and they conferred immunity. Nobody knows yet for sure whether you can gain complete immunity against COVID-19. It just hasn't been around long enough. There have been some reports in the literature that suggest that a patient or two has shown the ability to get the virus a second time. That normally would not be the case in most infectious diseases, but we don't completely have an answer to that. Should this be a neutralizing result, and should the antibodies that a person generally produces be effective against later infection with the same virus, then yes, this would be an indication of immunity. It's just not known at this point.
Can we talk a little bit about what near-term and long-term revenue opportunities look like by distributing this COVID test for investors who are on here?
Yeah, well, I feel more comfortable talking about near term because this is, all so unpredictable that, one is has to be very cautious to project too far out. But I think in terms of orders, and when I say orders, these are people that have paid with a credit card. We did about 800,000 over about 8 days, so about 100,000 a day, give or take. I think that's basically these are kind of smallish type orders of maybe 2 cases of 25. These tests are about $20. $20 per test, basically, with some discounts for volume. In addition to that, we've had inquiries for substantially larger amounts, although it would be fair to point out that many of the people making these inquiries are probably also talking to our competitors as well. These tests are generic in nature, and there are, as I noted, at least 24 companies in the United States marking them. So I think it will be, for the next few months, something that we'll generate, probably maybe at scale $200,000 to $300,000 a day in revenue, which for a company our size of under 20 people, that's pretty substantial. So I think we're going to make an impact and contribute to reducing the hopefully the mortality and morbidity of this fearsome pandemic. I would say in a long term, though, there is other value that will be brought to bear here for our company, and one of them is the speed at which we're forging relationships. I'm not at liberty to name names, but I can tell you in the last week we've had 3 or 4 discussions with Fortune 500, even Fortune 100 companies, major players in the field, that we would not normally get access to. And in many cases, these calls were initiated by them, not us. And I think these can play long-term dividends for our one test and so forth, and products like that. So I think it will position us well. Hopefully, this will not be a seasonal problem. That as the summer wears on, that the mortality and also the number of cases, diagnosed cases, will drop, and that we won't see it again. We don't know. Dr. Fauci has pointed out that this could recur in the fall, and it may be seasonal, like influenza, in which case there will be a sustained need for these types of tests. So time will tell. But I think on many levels this will add value to our company, and not to mention give us some additional financial resources as we continue to execute our core business, which is the intersection of diagnostics and machine learning and AI.
Jonathan, I'm just curious. Does the White House know what you're doing? What has been, if so, what has been their response to your efforts in what you're doing?
Well, at a high level, it's clear, particularly in the last week or two, that if you watch the briefings, as recently as last night, Deborah Birx, who I have spoken to on 2 occasions, I actually have her direct phone number and email. She actually gave it to me, White House Coronavirus Coordinator, has been speaking quite a bit about antibody testing. And a number of key opinion leaders, including former FDA Commissioner Gottlieb, have put this as part of their roadmap for bringing the country back. So antibody testing in general is very much right now on the minds of the leadership on the coronavirus. I have had some discussions with Dr. Birx and others. I think it would be an exaggeration to say that they're thinking about us and our products specifically, because as I mentioned, there are other players and more coming online. But I think maybe we contributed to the FDA's March 16th guidance, where they down-regulated this. I will tell you that we are also working at the early stages of working on a related concept, which is close to our current business focus of leveraging machine learning to create an app and an algorithm where users, not only of our products, but those of our competitors from around the world, can basically take a picture of the membrane and the stripe on the membrane and upload that to the cloud, which will not only store the results, and some studies suggest that the act of digitizing that improves the quantitative output of this test, which is not normally considered quantitative, but more importantly, and also enter some information about health history, such as the results of a PCR test, symptoms, and so forth, and that people that get these tests in May and June can see their results and compare that to that of hundreds of thousands or millions of others. At this point, it is conceptual. We are filing a patent application as early as today on this, but I have had some preliminary discussions with some very well-known companies, and there does seem to be some interest. So, we will keep Andy and Vin apprised of that. So there may be some ancillary product opportunities that go beyond merely distributing these rapid tests that could have more of a long-term value creation for our shareholders.
Yeah, some of your competitors, Harry Schein and Abbott Labs, some of their tests have come into gotten some publicity recently. How is your test different than theirs?
Well, the Abbott is easy. That is not an antibody test. That is a molecular test, albeit one that's quite fast, and it's seems to be a very impressive product. But it's not inexpensive. I think the device, as I read, is about $15,000. So you're certainly not going to have one of these in every household, let alone every doctor's office. But it definitely has its place. As far as Henry Schein is concerned, that is much more of a direct competitor, and I can't say how, if at all, our test differs from that one. I did point out earlier in this interview that these are generic, These are generic products. And Henry Schein is a very large and reputable medical device distributor. But I do think that 2020, being a diagnostics company, probably will be able to add some additional value that some of the bigger companies might not. There is a lot of competition, and Henry Schein, I think, is the largest player. Most of the other competitors appear to be either Chinese companies with maybe a small office here in the States, or small companies like 2020. I think Henry Schein is the only one that I know of right now that is a big company distributing these rapid antibody tests. Now, that could change in the weeks ahead. You may start seeing the big companies, the big diagnostic companies, rolling out their version of these, what are called lateral flow membrane tests.
And what percentage of the market, garnering what percentage of the market, what would be a success for you guys?
5%. If we could generate 5% of what we expect to be the market over the next 4 to 6 months, that could yield up to $100 million in revenue, possibly $50 to $100 million in revenue. So I think if 5% would be our goal. That's ambitious based on how much demand we expect to see, but I think it's potentially achievable, especially if we partner with some other companies. And if we're successful in our financing efforts, we are raising money under Regulation A or Reg A+. That's going to be important because that allows us to not only purchase inventory, but also to hire talent in terms of sales, marketing, logistics, operations, and so forth.
So one thing that I'm curious to hear about, and please do, for those who are watching, if you want to enter questions into the Q&A section, we're happy to try and get to them during this interview. But one question that did come in that I'm curious to hear about, as well as, as you go and focus on kind of these COVID-19 tests, how much is that pulling away your focus on your traditional, cancer screening tests? And does that delay you at all on progress being made on those, core fronts of your business?
Sure, it's a good question. To be frank, it is a diversion right now. But to be honest with you, even if we were not engaged in the coronavirus field, we would see some diminishment of ordering. People are the test. One test, blood test, requires somebody to go to the doctor and get a blood draw. It's not a finger stick type test like a corona check test. So, and right now people are not going to, are recommended not to go to the doctor unless it's an emergency. So we would be seeing a diminution in demand right now anyway. So it is a bit of a diversion. But it will be temporary, and we will. Now, having said that, as tests come in, and they do come in every day, we are running them, and our CLIA lab is operating. We are an essential business under Maryland law, so we have a skeleton crew here, but we are running tests, and we will continue to service people getting the test. I mentioned yesterday we identified an individual, apparently that was identified with the help of this test, with colon cancer, but I think by May we're going to start to refocus on one test. We have a lot going on there, both here and in China. As the year progresses, I don't think we're going to miss a beat. And as I mentioned, I do think there's some synergy, there's some overlap, particularly in terms of the relationships that we forge. So some of these relationships, whether it's a large retail pharmacy group or a large lab group or other companies, these companies can also be useful for us in terms of expanding one test once we get through this national emergency.
Yeah, before we get to the details of your raise, just go out 12 months from now. What does your company look like? What are you doing? What are you focusing on? What do you think you're working on?
I think 12 months from now, we will be a company with maybe 30 full-time employees, up from about 17 or 18 that we are right now. So we'll be not quite double, but we'll be definitely a third bigger. I think we will have a stronger balance sheet, which will allow us to invest in other areas. We were seeing some good 50% or more quarterly growth of one test before the outbreak, and I think that we're going to come back to that. I think you're going to see a lot of traction in China. We were admitted just before the outbreak to a very prestigious, what's called an accelerator in Shenzhen, China, run by Ping An, one of the largest healthcare entities in China. One of a small number of companies, I believe about a dozen out of 300 or 400 applicants, as I recall, to be selected for that. We're going to hopefully be able to leverage that opportunity in a few months, and that should pay dividends. So I think we're going to be very strong at that point. We are, as a Reg A qualified company, we are entitled to list our shares on a national exchange, including NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. We continue to look at the public markets as a liquidity opportunity for our shareholders. Hard to say whether it would be realistic to be doing that in 12 months, but it's certainly possible. I wouldn't rule that out. So I think we're going to be very strong, both from a revenue standpoint, but also a data acquisition standpoint. And in this new economy, the new world of big data and AI, data is the oil, if you will, and the value creator. Revenues are important, of course, but data is also very important. And I think what we acquire through both one test and if we're successful in the app that I mentioned for the coronavirus test, that's also going to be an asset that will build value for the company and its shareholders.
All right, you're raising on Start Engine. How much are you raising, and what's the valuation, and when does the raise end?
We are, and as you pointed out, StartEngine.com is the platform. They're one of the two largest platforms in the United States, most successful. This morning we passed 800,000 on Start Engine. We are one of the fastest moving companies. We're at the top of their page. We're on one of the three with most momentum out of, I think, about 50 issuers currently on the page. We expect to be on Start Engine through the end of this month, and we will, at that point, probably transition to another platform. Nothing against Start Engine; they've been fantastic. They're one of the best, but we want to give different communities of investors an opportunity to learn about what we're doing and to be part of our solution. So it's good to diversify. So I expect that we will be. We are big fans of equity crowdfunding. I've been a proponent of it, and Andy knows this for years. We did Reg CF. We were probably one of the first life science companies to hit the maximum of 1.06 million at the time, and we've now raised about well over 6 million from Regulation A. I was a fan before the coronavirus emergency, and I'm even more of one now. You know, venture capital, it's no secret, is completely frozen right now. But there's no sign, at least from our perspective, of any slowdown whatsoever in equity crowdfunding. It is as robust as ever, and that's a good thing not only for us, but it's good for the country. So I think we're going to be doing that. We're going to be equity crowdfunding at least through the summer, possibly into the fourth quarter, in addition to seeking institutional investments as well.
Jonathan, do you see this as your last crowdfunding raise? Do you think you'll be doing another one, or do you think your next raise will be exclusively from institutional investors, or do you think, and this is, looking a little far ahead, and by definition, the discussion becomes a little speculative. But is there a chance that you might be planning for a liquidity event, within the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think most likely I see our transition going from equity crowdfunding to a public listing, and there would be a crossover round in that. So the institutional investors would be crossover investors, and what that means, there's a certain category of investor that specializes in investing directly into a company with their listing on an exchange. That is particularly likely to happen if the SEC and Congress do what they've been talking about doing for the past 2 years or so to make it easier for companies to go public. Currently, it's simply too expensive to maintain a public company. And I think that needs to change. And what you're going to see, I predict, and the SEC, to its credit, has been moving in this direction. They recently substantially increased the ceiling for the amount that can be raised under Reg CF from $1 million to $5 million. So they're starting to move in this direction. I think that the inevitable recession, and hopefully it will be just a recession and not a depression, in the wake of this shutdown, Congress and the federal government will be looking at an array of tools to do that. And one of them should be expanding equity crowdfunding as well as a path to a public market. We need to make it easier for companies to go public. The Jobs Act did a great job allowing ordinary Americans, not just the rich, to buy stock in pre-public companies, but it didn't do anything to make it to allow them to sell that stock. So we have to address that side of the equation. I will leave it to others, securities experts, to suggest specifically how they do that, but that should be part of the recovery. I was interviewed earlier in the week by the Hill newspaper, Congressional Quarterly, The Hill, and I made that plea. Hopefully it will be read by members of Congress. This has to be part of our national recovery from this current tragic, wound to America's economy.
If I could just interject really quickly here, I want to tell you what it means to be a science-based organization. Well, we've been sitting here talking. I just received data on 12 more patients.
That's outstanding.
Yeah, and if I may, go ahead. Did you want to finish, Michael, or?
Well, it's all in line with what I've said. All negative patients by PCR were negative on our test. Positive patients were positive on our test.
Fantastic. Let me read, if I may, I want to read a quote that I saw yesterday, an email from a physician, a primary care physician from a Denver, Colorado medical practice who contributed data to the study that Michael put out, and I'm just going to read verbatim. I find the product from your manufacturer to be highly reliable. I look forward to further testing patients in my community. I congratulate you in 2020 for being one of the first companies in the nation to understand the need and importance of providing clinicians with rapid point-of-care COVID-19 antibody testing.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap up at least the questions from the three of us. Chris, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, there's actually a couple. One that I thought was pretty interesting was, were these manufacturing tests also used in China where the coronavirus has since become more controlled?
That's a great question. Yeah, yes. So, and this is something we probed at considerably. So, and this is actually a competitive advantage. I'm glad you asked that. One of the manufacturers, and only one of them, their tests, and they are approved by the Chinese FDA. And from all that I've been told by Chinese experts, the Chinese FDA is every bit as rigorous as the United States FDA. That may not have been the case 10 years ago, but that is the case today. Their tests were used, including in Wuhan, the epicenter, and they showed us a letter of commendation translated into English, signed by, 20 hospitals, and about half of them were in Wuhan. So theirs was. The other ones were not. They came out a little bit late. Most of these came out in late February, and at that point, China was already sort of on the other side of their curve, if you will. So that is a distinguishing characteristic. And there was a paper, a manuscript, that I think has now been published by a group of critical care and respiratory experts in China, including several from Wuhan, basically talking about the need for these types of tests to be part of the screening response. So I think that's very interesting. So the answer was yes, although they seem to come somewhat late in their emergency.
Got it. And one other question that came through, I'm curious to hear your answer on, is how will you handle if someone like a Quest Diagnostics kind of comes in and begins to resell these similar types of products?
Well, I think that's I think in the next few weeks you will see some of the large players distributing or otherwise utilizing these types of tests. The good news is some of those companies are actually talking to us, probably in fairness talking to our competitors as well. So if we have even one large relationship, or I should say one relationship with a larger company, I think we'll do fine. Remember, our goal is 5% of the market, and that's an ambitious goal. So I think if we achieve that, we will have done well for both our shareholders and for the country.
All right. I think that's a good place to end things on. 2020 GeneSystems is raising on Start Engine. So you can go check out their rates on startengine.com. You can read our recommendation and our coverage of 2020 at earlyinvesting.com. You can also read KingsCrowd coverage at kingscrowd.com. We've got a lot of content out there. Dr. Leibowitz, Jonathan Cohen, thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going. We'll keep our members updated, and we'll go on from there. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us. So stay safe.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
You too. Take care. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.